youngsters from Liverpool, England. The Beatles have held this title for 8 years. My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were 4 very talented guys.
Welcome back to the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. I'm your host, Jack Lawless. Today I'd like to welcome Simon Barber and Brian O'Connor, a songwriting duo from Liverpool, England, but you may know them as the hosts of the Sodajerker podcast. Their podcast features interviews with some of the world's most successful songwriters, including David Crosby, Jeff Lynne, Paul Simon, and even Paul McCartney. Simon and Brian interviewed Paul a few years ago during the release of Paul's album, Egypt Station. They're as big of Beatles fans as anyone, and I'm excited to have them on. Thank you guys so much for coming on the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. This is the first time I have 2 guests on, so welcome.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
So let's get started. How did you guys first hear the Beatles?
Shall I start, Simon?
Yeah, go on.
I think about this quite a lot, and it's hard to pinpoint it exactly. Obviously, growing up in Liverpool, you're sort of conscious of them from quite early on. I think I was conscious of the Beatles more as solo artists, or just these guys who used to pop up on TV every now and again on chat shows and things. We had a chat show called Aspel and Company that was on over here, and George and Ringo would pop up on that, and Paul from time to time. And I think the first music I can remember from any of them was probably the Frog Chorus, to be honest, because I was about 5 or 6 at the time, so I was the target market. So I was very conscious of Paul in terms of his music, I guess, from an early age, or a certain facet of his music. And then later on, just as I got a bit older, 9 or 10, I got my first Walkman, started pilfering my dad's cassette collection and listening to his Beatles cassettes in particular, particularly the later period, so I guess Sgt. Pepper onwards, and particularly Abbey Road. I remember being particularly keen on that, and I would gravitate a lot towards Paul's songs in particular, because I guess he had the more jaunty, child-friendly songs of the bunch. Well, if you don't include Ringo. So yeah, it's sort of a scattered thing. I was aware of them as people, and then became aware of them as a band later on, and probably in my mid-teens when I started to get into music properly and join a band and all that sort of stuff, I really went deep into the catalogue and really sort of fell in love with them in a whole new way. Simon?
I think mine's probably a little bit more vague than that, I guess. I mean, I know that my mum and dad had the records, and I remember Rubber Soul in particular because of that striking cover. And we used to like to engage, me and my sisters used to like to engage with records because there was a record player in the back room, and we used to go in there and sort of put records on, and particularly put them on the wrong speed. I don't know why. Bit satanic, but we used to listen to 45s of the Beatles, I know that, and we had those records, and we definitely played them quite a bit. And I guess we used to like sing into hairbrushes and put on little shows for our parents and things like that, probably. So I knew the music from that, but I had no real concept of who they were or what kind of impact they'd had or anything like that. And then I guess as we got older and started making music ourselves and things, they were always just in the air in Liverpool. You know, it's like this constant sort of cloud or presence. So I had a sense of them from that, but probably it wasn't totally consolidated for me until the anthology. You know, when that was on TV, that was probably the point that I realised that these people had made this colossal contribution to popular music, you know, and that they were worth exploring. And I think probably at that point I went back and actually started listening properly to all those records. I mean, everybody knows they're just inescapable, aren't they? The biggest songs from Sgt. Pepper or whatever. But, you know, I'd certainly probably at that point never listened to Beatles for Sale or you know, deeper cuts on the White Album or things like that. And that was the point, I think, where I went back and sort of mined the rest of their catalogue.
Yeah, it was the same for me. The anthology was huge, really, because we were like 15, 16 when that was on TV. So exactly the right age, and, you know, in a band together and writing songs. And so we just kind of ate that up. And around the same time, the Ian MacDonald book, Revolution in the Head. I'm not sure when that came out. Was it 94 or something, maybe? But I remember getting that around the same time as well. So the combination of Revolution in the Head, of devouring that book, and Mark Lewison's recording sessions book, and the anthology, and All the Free as a Bird, Real Love, Hullabaloo that was going on. I mean, they were sort of particularly inescapable at that point, but we were so open to learning about them by then. And same as I probably didn't discover certain, well, I know I didn't discover certain albums till later on. Revolver I didn't really listen to until that point, around sort of 16, 17. And I think it came to like A Hard Day's Night and Beatles for Sale even later. Like I knew the obvious songs from those records, but yeah, as I said, the deep cuts were new to me.
Being from Liverpool, was there a stigma around liking the Beatles' music? Like, was it considered cliche?
When I kind of said that it hung over us, I think that the spectre of the Beatles was something that hung over a lot of musicians our age when we were growing up, and maybe for the generation before, I'm not sure. But it always felt to me like when we were in bands in Liverpool, it was perhaps not cool to be reproducing a kind of Beatles-esque, jangly Mersey beat kind of sound, you know? Even though there were always bands like that, I always felt that would be seen as kind of like a bit passé, you know? I don't know, did you feel that, Bri?
I mean, and certainly not now. I think, again, growing up in the 80s, there was definitely a sense of this attitude that, I don't know, there was maybe a little bit of a backlash against the Beatles around that time. I think particularly in the 70s, or so I hear, there was a bit of a, maybe not an outright rejection of them, but people definitely were keen to escape from under that shadow. So, you know, a lot of the Liverpool bands of the 70s were I think, almost went out the way not to sort of cite the Beatles as a reference. And then when I was born in 79, and then as I became aware of the Beatles, you did sense that some people were maybe a bit resentful of them, but I don't think it was so much the music or anything like that. I think it was just the prominence, and also there was this prevailing attitude in Liverpool at the time that anyone from the city who you know made a few quid, you know, moved out of the city and had sort of turned their back somehow on Liverpool, which is, I thought it was nonsense as a kid, to be honest, and I still think it's nonsense now. And I think some of that bled into how people perceived the Beatles, that they'd sort of, you know, as soon as they made it big, they left us behind, forgot about us, you know.
I don't think that's changed that much, though. I think I remember when Ringo was on a TV show some years ago. Was it like was it Jonathan Ross or something?
Ross, yeah.
And he said, like, do you ever think about Liverpool? And Ringo went, no. And I remember there was outrage, wasn't there? There was people writing into the local paper saying, all we needed was some support from Ringo.
Yeah. You know? Well, there was also a topiary, a Beatles topiary outside a train station in Liverpool, and someone chainsawed Ringo's head off. this hedge. Yeah. I thought he was just being honest. I think Jonathan Ross asked them, well, at the time they had the Liverpool 8 album out, so he was sort of, you know, he was branding this album as, oh, I'm from Liverpool. And then Jonathan Ross asked him on this chat show at the time, you know, do you miss the city? Do you miss living in it? And he just went, no. And it was just really, but though that was a very Scouse thing to say, because Scouse being obviously a slang term for Liverpudlians, you know, he was being honest. He was asked the question, he gave an honest answer. And the Beatles, one of the great things about the Beatles is they were always straight down the line and honest and spoke their mind, you know. And he wasn't going to sort of soft soap anyone or say, oh, yeah, of course. Oh, you know, wish it was back there living in Toxteth. I mean, the guy lives in LA, you know, or has lived in Monaco and things, a place like this. He's not exactly going to be yearning for Liverpool 8 necessarily. So yeah, you know, I thought that was actually quite, that was a very Liverpool thing. He was just honest, but some people took it the wrong way. So yeah, I guess there is some sensitivity amongst some Liverpool folk, but I think that they're sort of a dying breed, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a very proud city, though, isn't it? In that sense.
Yeah.
So how did you two meet, and how did you decide to begin a songwriting partnership that would eventually evolve into your Sodajerker podcast?
Well, we met at school when we were sort of 13, 14, Bri. Brian's great with dates.
Yes, well, we met when we were like 11, but we didn't become friends probably till a couple of years into high school. Yeah, so we were in the same class from the start of high school, but we didn't really sort of enter each other's orbits for maybe a couple of years properly, as friends.
Yeah, and I was in a band, wasn't I, at the time, with some of our classmates, little beat combo called Blue Rinse. And it was just us sort of getting together and, trying to write songs and rehearse and things like that. And Brian joined that band and took up the bass, learned to play the bass in order to join that band. And so from there, we just, as that band sort of split down the middle, me and Bryce sort of went our own separate way and started writing songs together ourselves. And we had a good music teacher at school, and he was interested in songs we were writing, and we bought a 4-track machine from him and started recording in my back room and just devoted loads of time to it. I think that was always the most fun part of the process for us, wasn't it, Bri? Because we did do a lot of gigs over the years, and as you probably know, gigging is like 90% sitting in a van and waiting for sound check and stuff like that, and 10% fun on stage. And so for us, writing and recording was sort of 100% fun. So we just stuck with that, really.
Yeah, and then we were in a band together for, I guess, another 12 years, something like that. And then once that one sort of dissolved, we still wanted to continue writing songs together. So Sodajerker emerged from the ashes of another band we were in called Santa Carla. And and so that was, so Sodajerker in its initial incarnation was a vehicle for us as songwriters for hire, I guess. And then I guess 2 years into that, we were maybe wondering how we could drive traffic to the website and, get people interested in us. And Sai suggested, well, what about a podcast? And we figured, well, what will it be about? Well, songwriting. And eventually we landed at the idea of, well, long form interviews with songwriters. There were some podcasts about songwriting here, but they weren't interviews with successful songwriters in the vein of, in the format of like Mark Maron's podcast or Nerdist or any of the ones that were around at the time. So we just thought we'll nip in and maybe corner that market for a while. And so that's what we did.
You both have interviewed some of the world's most famous songwriters, such as David Crosby, Jeff Lynne, especially Paul McCartney. Mm-hmm. What are the most interesting parts of your conversations with these people?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to sit down with any renowned person like that in any field, really. You're going to have an interesting time no matter what, but obviously we're suckers for insights into the creative process. So, aside from great stories or funny things that people say, if someone can give us something about the nuts and bolts of how they make things, or how they conceptualize what they do, then that's like, we're in heaven then, especially if they've got some smart way of describing, creativity and how they produce something out of nothing. That's really what we're after, I think.
So let's talk about your interview with Paul McCartney, which is just incredible.
Sure.
What was going through your heads while you were speaking with Paul?
Don't screw this up.
Oh my God.
And oh my God.
That's Paul McCartney.
Yeah. It's funny, obviously we were ahead of the interview. We were nervous, but personally speaking, I'm nervous before every interview because I just want it to go well. I don't want to screw it up. I don't want to make a fool of myself. And we want to end up with a good episode at the end of it. So I mean, the nerves were probably a little, higher than usual. But it was funny once we got in the room, because on the day it was done at LIPA, the Liverpool Institute for Performing Arts, of which Paul is the lead patron in a performing arts school in Liverpool. And he was there that day to do a Q&A, a live Q&A with Jarvis Cocker from Pulp, and then he did a performance, like an unplugged performance there, which we got to see as well. And so we were there from like sort of midday, and probably by the time we got in the room, it was like 5:30. So by that point, any nerves had really just ebbed away, and we were really keen. I personally, I was just really keen to get in that room and just get going. So once we got in there, it was, and he's, as anyone who's interviewed Paul will tell you, he's extremely good at putting people at their ease. He knows people are coming in nervous, and he's a very sort of welcoming and warm person. And we just set up and sat down, and I guess sort of professionalism took over. And we just got down to asking the questions and trying to listen and take in what he was saying without thinking, oh shit, it's Paul McCartney, and not just stare at him, and we managed it. I mean, I guess if we were doing that a year into starting the podcast, it might have been a different story. We might have gone to pieces, but we'd had about 7 years experience at that point, so it was a good time to do it because we felt a lot more capable, I think, at that point. Simon, don't know if you have any memories.
I remember you stealing his bag.
Oh yeah, I accidentally almost walked out with his. He had a sort of over the shoulder satchel thing, which looked exactly like the one Si had with him. And as we went to leave, I just picked it up, threw it over my shoulder, and then realised, oh shit, it's Paul's bag. Let's put that down, because he had like a 7-foot tall bodyguard there who probably a rugby tackled me to the ground before I'd even got out the door. But yeah, it was a lovely experience, wasn't it, Si?
Yeah.
Just such a nice guy.
Yeah, he was great, yeah. And he was really engaged, like he was interested, like there's no reason for him to want to know where we got the name Sodajerker from or what it means, but he, while we were standing around and packing up and stuff, he asked about that, and I could see in his eyes that he was connected with my answer, like he was engaged by it. And then he said, well, it's catchy.
Yeah. So that was all the approbation we needed.
So where does the name come from?
Oh, the name comes from, well, it's you've probably heard of a Sodajerker or a Sodajerker. It's like a 50s Americana era term for the guys who work the soda fountain, basically, in diners and places like that. And I just saw it in an article I was reading, and I just liked the shape of the word, and I just thought, and it goes nicely, it alliterates with songwriting, and then Si looked a little bit more into the etymology of it, and then just discovered that it sort of the work that the persona of the Sodajerker was kind of akin to a songwriter, in that he'd come up with creative names for what he was serving up. So I guess not just the Sodajerker, but also the people working, the short order cooks and things like that in a diner. If someone ordered a particular item off the menu, they had their own slang, very creative slang terms. What's a good example?
Well, they'd call like butter axle grease, or they'd call soup belly wash, or it'd be linked to some kind of action. Like if someone wanted a black coffee, they'd say draw one in the dark.
Yeah.
Or they'd say dress one pig for a ham sandwich,
Yeah, or scrambled egg on toast was what Adam and Eve on a raft and Wreckham.
Yeah.
Which is unbelievably creative. And we just thought, well, that's what a songwriter does, really. He takes the mundane and he elevates it to something interesting and exciting.
Oh, I like that. I never knew the story behind your name.
Well, there you go.
Was there anything that stood out about Paul McCartney's creative process, or anything that was different than the processes of other artists that you've interviewed?
I wouldn't say he was any different particularly than anyone else. He was totally engaged with writing songs and trying to write the best songs that he could, which I thought at his age is really interesting. He hadn't lost any of that enthusiasm for the process or any of that passion for the mystery of songwriting, where you sit at the piano late at night and you noodle around and something comes and you think, oh, that could be something special, and maybe you'll develop it to a point where you'll remember it and then you'll come back the next night. And he was still doing that, actively doing that and producing songs that way, which we thought was nice. And of course, he had loads of stuff on his phone, one of which he played us, which ended up on the next record. But
McCartney 3 it ended up on, the Kiss of Venus it was. That was another crazy moment, actually.
Yeah, so he was actively capturing his ideas on his phone, and he was willing to play one to us. So in that sense, that leapt out, because not everybody does that,
Yeah, one extraordinary thing about that as well is that particular song, as well as ending up on McCartney 3, the lyric was included in his lyric book that he brought out towards the end of last year. So it's kind of crazy that this song that's wound up in this 2-volume set of his lyrics, this, I guess, what will be a definitive collection of his lyrics, we were among the first people to hear like a snippet of that song, which it blows my mind anyway.
Yeah, that must have been crazy.
Incredible.
I mean, you came a long way from just watching Anthology on the TV.
Well, that's it. Yeah, you know, because that's happened a lot with the podcast. You know, people we were fans of as teenagers and would talk about the music and jam their songs and things. People like Sting or people like Nile Rodgers, or, you know, we've wound up face to face with a lot of these people, and you can't help but think back to yourself as a, you know, snot-nosed kid, and like, would you, you know, if you could go back and tell your younger self what you'll go on to, yeah, it's mind-blowing, really.
Are there any questions that you didn't get to ask Paul? Or are there any questions that you'd love to ask Ringo if you had him on?
Ooh.
I mean, like I said about Paul's sort of ongoing enthusiasm, I'd like to talk a bit more about that and find out a little bit more about what makes him tick, because there's really no reason for him to be doing any of this at this point, you know. And the fact that he's still flying around the world doing shows at 80 years old is just, you know, insane. The man has just Duracell bunny energy, doesn't he? It's crazy. So I'd love to know a little bit more about what motivates him, I suppose. But I haven't really thought about what I'd ask Ringo.
No, me neither. I mean, we have looked into getting Ringo on at certain points because we sort of know his UK publicist, but it's just the opportunity's never arisen, really. No, I don't know what I'd ask him, but I think there's definitely stuff in Ringo's, you know, solo catalogue that I'd love to ask about, especially the early records. Like I'm a big fan of the 1973 Ringo album and Goodnight Vienna, stuff that, you know, which have some great tunes on them. And just his experiences, I guess, because he has become quite, I don't know if prolific is the word, but he's written a lot over the decades with a variety of different people. So I guess, you know, how he likes to collaborate, questions like that maybe. But no, I've not really thought about it in too much depth.
I think I'd ask him if he misses Liverpool.
Give him a chance to rectify his mistake.
As songwriters yourselves, are Lennon and McCartney the best songwriters in popular music?
Tough one, that, I think.
It is. I mean, it's hard to say whether they're the best. I mean, most important, arguably, in terms of the sheer, you know, influence they've had on generations of songwriters. It'd be hard to find another songwriter or pair of songwriters who could stake the claim to have had that level of influence on people. And so in terms of how many people they've inspired and stuff, you know, maybe they're the most important or influential. But best, that's hard because there's a lot of, you know,
a lot of great
songwriters.
Yeah. I mean, as a unit, they sort of complemented each other in this almost supernatural way, didn't they? You know, they're from the same area. They happen to be from the same area. They happen to find each other. They happen to work together consistently enough that, you know, they obviously liked each other. I mean, it's all kind of miraculous in some way, isn't it, that it ever happened? And the catalogue takes some beating, doesn't it, in terms of the depth and the breadth of it in that short time.
Yeah, and the fact that it was achieved in such a short time. I was just going to say that, you know, compressed within, you know, I guess the Beatles' recording career lasted, what, 8 years? Not even that, really, because they were pretty much split up by 1970. John had buggered off, hadn't he? But, you know, so maybe 7 years, I guess, in earnest.
But there's a lot of great catalogues out there, isn't there? Certainly by songwriting teams, you know.
Well, yeah, you know,
Goffin and Kings and
Bacharach and David, and then you've got sort of solo writers like Paul Simon and people like that who've pretty formidable catalogues.
The Bee Gees catalogue, it perhaps equals that in some ways as well, I would say.
Yeah. So yeah, you know, you obviously, like, we're huge fans with, you know, they're massively important to us as they are to millions of people. But I try and look at it as objectively as possible when I'm thinking in terms of best. You know, I'm not sure if there is an outright best. They're up there, obviously, top table. But it's a very long banquet table with lots of people sitting at it.
Yeah, and you go to different people for different things, don't you? You know, like McCartney's melodies are kind of unsurpassable for me, but then perhaps I would go to someone like Paul Simon for the lyrics, you know? So,
yeah.
Yeah, it really depends.
I mean, I would love to hear Paul's melodies paired with, like, some lyrics that are a bit more meaningful, you know? Like, no offense to Paul, but...
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't disagree. Yeah, when he puts his mind to it, I think he's a great lyricist and an underrated lyricist. But there are quite a few examples where you can tell he's just sort of gone with the first thing that popped into his head. It's almost like, we talk to a lot of songwriters who talk about like the gibberish lyric or the nonsense lyric that they just use to map out the song kind of thing. And I think a lot of Paul's lyrics sound like he just got too attached to that early nonsense lyric, and he just stuck with it. He just thought, "Fuck it, I'm Paul McCartney." And some of them work, God love them. Some of them do work, and you grow to sort of love those songs. There's a lot of his songs I love, which have not particularly great lyrics, and don't stand up to much scrutiny. But the whole package is just very appealing because he's so musically strong. He can turn a bit of a duff lyric into something halfway decent, But there are great lyrics in there, I think. Plenty of them. Si, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, well, there's a double bound kind of lyric book now, isn't there? We can go through and pick out the best ones.
Yeah. But there's great, and he could be, I think he's been described as maybe a bit facile and a bit shallow compared to say, John's lyrics, But if you look at some of Paul's lyrics from his Beatles era, they're easily as honest and candid and revealing as John's are. It's just Paul maybe doesn't like to read into, or he doesn't like people to maybe read too much into his lyrics, whereas John was quite happy to lay it all out there, expose himself, and quite literally.
Paul is perhaps more guarded in the way that he represents things in his lyrics, I think.
Yes, he would claim, don't read too much in because I'm just, not necessarily writing about myself, but I think you could point to quite a few lyrics where chances are he is writing about himself. And he's good at it when he does. If you look at the Chaos and Creation album, which I think many would cite as his most candid lyrically, and his most, I guess, direct. He's being quite, because I think that album was written around the time of his divorce and things like that. So, and it comes through, when he wants to, he can be a very sort of meaningful lyricist.
Now, do you guys have a favorite memory associated with the Beatles? Would it be your interview with Paul?
I mean, that's got to be it's got to be it.
We have had a lot of lovely Beatles sort of experiences over the years. When we were at Liverpool, we saw George Martin there, didn't we? And we saw Paul a few times there. We've seen Paul in concert, which has always been incredible. We visited Abbey Road for the first time. We went to Studio 2, and that was really incredible. But nothing compares.
Saw Paul play there as well, didn't we?
Yeah, nothing compares to the experiences we had that week, I think, because during that week that we interviewed Paul, we ended up at seeing a small concert that he did at Abbey Road for a very privileged invited audience.
There was 90 people there. Yeah, we were there that day for it was just by chance, really. We were scheduled to interview Nile Rodgers at Abbey Road lunchtime that day, and we literally wrapped that interview, and then they said, right, okay, just down the corridor, Paul's playing a concert. Well, they didn't say exactly what was going on, but
they just sort of strapped some wristbands on us, didn't they, and said, come this way.
Yeah, we knew Paul was there that day. We didn't really know what he was doing. We knew there was some kind of event going on in Studio 2, but we weren't sure what it was, and we certainly didn't think we'd be privy to it. But yeah, we literally wrapped the interview with Niall. They gave us wristbands and said, okay, it's if you want to get yourself to Studio 2 down the corridor. And
we walked in and there was Orlando Bloom and Johnny Depp and Amy Schumer and Stormzy and Kylie Minogue, and we thought, something's going on.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was mad. Really weird.
Yeah, and there was a stage set up, and then it turned out it was a 90-minute concert, full band. Giles Martin was up in the control room recording it for Spotify, and it was being filmed, and we just found ourselves there just by chance, because we were booked to do this interview on that particular day. We happened to be there, and they arranged for us to go and watch it. So that was something special. Paul at one point got off stage and played Lady Madonna on the Mrs. Mills piano, which is obviously on so many Beatles records.
So we were basically just standing around that piano watching him play it.
Yeah. He was just on the floor of the studio with all of us, and back to us. So we're all stood around the piano, and he's blasting out Lady Madonna. So that's we could have died happy at that moment, pretty much. I think we both knew this is probably never getting any better than this.
Yeah.
In terms of experience, we've gone on to have other lovely experiences doing the podcast, but I think we both knew that was the zenith. How could it possibly get better than this?
And then a couple of days later, we were face to face with him, weren't we, doing the interview?
Yeah, I mean, we got to see him. Obviously, we saw him play that on that Monday, and then on the Wednesday we interviewed him. But earlier on the Wednesday, as mentioned before, he did an unplugged performance in the little auditorium they have at Lipper. And it was the first time he'd ever, the school's been around since 96, I think, 95, 96. But it was the first time he'd ever performed there. So he did this Q&A with Jarvis, and then he went off stage, and then they brought the curtain up, and there's like a little, acoustic guitars and a little drum kit set up. And everyone was like, wow, because it was a total surprise to the audience. But we'd actually seen him sound checking earlier in the day. We'd been led through that particular auditorium as he was sound checking with Confidant, was it, from Egypt Station, I think?
Yeah.
So we knew that was coming, but the audience didn't. So there was this whoop of delight when the curtain came up and they saw the guitars. So we got to see basically 2 free McCartney gigs, very intimate McCartney gigs in the space of, I guess, 72 hours. So yeah, it took, and we were even invited. He played the Cavern on the following day, which we were invited to attend, but I think we were both just so completely overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the previous few days. We were like, no, I think we're happy with what we've
we've had
we've experienced. We've had, like they say on quiz shows, we're not going to gamble for the star prize. We've had a lovely day. We'll just take what we've won. We'll take the money. And so it was just, mind-blowing week. So, in terms of favourite Beatles experiences, but those are the...
It's the magic week, isn't it?
But we did get to see, as I said, we got glimpses of Paul. We both sort of met him fleetingly in the past when we've been at Lipper. Like, I graduated from Lipper and met him when he graduated. I was hanging around there one day with a friend of mine who was a student there, and I met him in a corridor, just a fleeting handshake, and we saw the first ever Lipper graduation, which was literally about 2 months after Linda died. We attended because we were students there at the time, but it was thought that Paul wouldn't be there, and at the very last second, everyone was sat in the auditorium, and he just came in through a side door and took a seat a couple of rows in front of us. So that was our first ever glimpse of Paul in the flesh, and we were both like open-mouthed. And yet we saw George Martin did a Q&A there a couple of years after that, which we got to go and watch, which was great, So
we did a bonus episode with Giles not too long back as well.
We did, we're talking about the Let It Be remix box set and stuff. That was lovely. So over the years we've had a few nice little sort of encounters, if you like, with Beatles and Beatle-related people.
Now, do you think there's any plans for Giles to remix the Beatles' earlier albums and release those in the next couple of years?
I mean, you would think they would have something up the sleeve for the 60th anniversaries. I mean, it'll be 60th anniversary of Please Please Me and with the Beatles next year, won't it? So I imagine they won't let that go by without some sort of release. I don't know if it would be the all singing, all dancing box set that we've had for Sgt. Pepper and the White Album stuff, because I just don't think there's the volume of outtakes and alternate material there to really justify a huge box set type thing. But who knows? But I'm sure there'll be something. I'm sure they maybe remix those early albums. Maybe they got something in store for Revolver and things like that. But who knows? They keep their cards close to their chest, don't they, those Apple folks?
So who are your favorite Beatles?
Well, I think we've already hinted at it.
Yeah. We're Paul guys.
It's always, I mean, as I said at the top of the show, from a young age, I gravitated towards his material before I even knew about how the writing worked in the band and how it was different people singing and all that. I just thought of Beatles as this one homogenous blob. I didn't think of, but as time went on and I was like, oh, right. Oh, that was one of my favourite songs when I was younger. Oh, yeah, I love that one too. I started to realise a lot of my favourite songs were Paul's songs. There was just something about his style and his sound that just spoke to me, I suppose. And it's carried on that way. I mean, I love them all, worship them all, but not literally. But I haven't got an altar or anything. But yeah, that Paul's just, I don't know, he's just... Some people you just click with, don't you know? Paul has this thing that he says about his band that he's had with him now for like 20 years. You know, I remember him in an interview saying, "I just like the noise they make," you know, and that's how I think of Paul. Really, I just like the noise he makes wherever he does. I'm into it. You know, I mean, I'm not completely sort of blinded by adoration. You know, there's some stuff I like better than other stuff in terms of solo material and even his Beatles songs. But generally speaking, it's his stuff that speaks to me the most. And so I'm probably speaking for you as well.
Yeah, there's not much to add. I appreciate all of them for different reasons, I think. But yeah, Paul is the one that connects most closely with my interests and enthusiasms, I guess.
Yeah, and I think he's the biggest... I mean, it's almost becoming a bit of a cliche to say it, but he's almost as big a Beatles fan as Beatles fans. He's the one who seems to get it the most. You know, I mean, maybe obviously John, you know, it was cut off in you know, from, you know, we never got to experience John looking back, you know, 40, 50 years on. He might have you know, been less dismissive of some aspects of the Beatles, you know, as he grew older, and George too. You know, George was quite resentful of certain aspects of the band, I think, but maybe had he been able to grow older, and you know, he might have looked upon certain things more fondly and appreciated what they did more. But I think Paul, I don't know, he always seemed to have more of an attachment to the whole thing, like the fact that, you know, he still records at Abbey Road so much, and you know, and he kept his relations with George Martin and Jeff Emerick. He seemed to really feel a strong bond with those people from that time, and the you know, on Abbey Road, and you know, he still keeps the Mellotron from Abbey Road and the lights that they used to use, to the moody lighting that they, you know, these red bulbs that they had in you know, he's got all that stuff. He holds on to. He appreciates the value of it all, I think, maybe more than the other Beatles did or do. I don't know. That's just the impression I get anyway.
Does their music hold up against contemporary music? Like, we're seeing this resurgence in their popularity. Is that due to like nostalgia or like a big budget they have now? Or do people still hold their music near and dear?
I mean, I'd say it holds up and still has a really important place in the lives of millions of people. You know, and I don't think that's just nostalgia or marketing or anything, really. I mean, some of the work is quite specific to the time in which it was made, of course, and it'd be hard for it not to be, but there's so much in there that relates directly to the human experience, I would say. You know, you can be moved by the more heartfelt songs, their sense of humour. Even if you look outside the music, the sort of innovations in terms of sound and all of that stuff, it's such an appealing package. And, you know, if it's about communication, then they had such a strong antenna for communicating with people. And I feel like all these years after they stopped making music, those signals are still strong, you know. They're still bouncing off our eardrums, I guess, and resonating with us. So yeah, it feels like it's not going away anytime soon. I mean, human beings love major accomplishments, don't they? It's aspirational, and it represents the best of what we're capable of as people. And that's like what the Beatles did. You know, it's a contribution on the highest level as far as I'm concerned. You know, people say, oh, you know, they changed the world and whatever, but they have immeasurably improved the lives of millions of people for decades since they even stopped making music. So yeah, in that sense, I'd say it's going to be around for a long time.
Yeah. Amen, brother.
So what are your favorite Beatles albums?
I'd have to say the best of the Beatles.
What would you say, Si? It changes
Well,
for me.
yeah, I mean, it changes all the time, but maybe today I'll say the White Album. just because I remember when I first got into that, how overwhelming it felt, the scale of the ambition of it, even though I know it's kind of all over the place and a bit messy. Like, it wasn't enough to have Back in the USSR and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. They had Martha My Dear and Obla Dee and Blackbird and Dear Prudence. And I mean, that's just like, what? What? Who else can... I mean, it's obscene, really, isn't it? A lot of artists would make their entire careers on one of those songs. So, yeah, I remember just being overwhelmed by that record. So that's my pick for today anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's at the moment, it's probably joint white album for, as I just said, the sheer scope, the range of styles and sounds, and maybe Rubber Soul I'd put joint top at the moment, just because that felt like quite a transitional album for them. They started to make that step from being I guess a pop band to something else. The songwriting took a kind of leap up in maturity, and there'd been glimmers of that with Help on stuff like Yesterday and things like that. But they just seemed to take a leap up in terms of the songwriting and the arranging and the invention and incorporating exotic instruments like the sitar and things like that. And just, just the strength of the material on it. There's a couple of lightweights, but to have an album where you can afford to bury In My Life on deep on side 2, I think says it all about that album. I mean, I like every song, but there are a couple that you think, yeah, okay, maybe I would have left that one off. But yeah, it's just, I think it's like that album's leading the way to what's coming next with Revolver, And George Harrison said he felt like they were like companion albums. I'm not so sure that's the case. I think Revolver's a little bit more of a eclectic record. I think Rubber Soul's very much of a piece, and that's another reason I like it. It's all the songs pretty much belong together, whereas once you get onto Revolver and beyond, it gets quite varied, which is great, and that's what's so good about those albums in a way. But I do like an album that sounds like it's all the songs belong together. It's a cohesive whole,
Yeah, when George said that Rubber Soul and Revolver were companion albums, that has to be like the only time I ever disagreed with a Beatle.
Yeah.
I mean, they're so different. Like, at the time when he said that, he probably didn't even remember what those two records even sounded like.
He was doing a lot of acid around 65, 66. So, yeah, in his mind, maybe he felt like they were just recorded back to back, right. Which wasn't far off. The rate that they recorded in those days, it was like 2 albums a year, wasn't it? And a tour in between. And it was crazy. I mean, that's just what's so remarkable about them. They were producing songs of such quality so consistently and with a touring schedule like they had to deal with as well in the days when traveling was no picnic, all that flying in like the mid-60s. But yeah. So yeah, Rubber Soul and the White Album for me, joint favorites.
So guys, what have you been up to recently? Are you involved in any projects? Any new episodes coming out?
We've got a lot on the slate, haven't we, Bri? We've been sort of researching and recording quite a few episodes recently. So I can look at my desktop and tell you that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's about 8 episodes in the queue at the moment. So we've got...
They're recorded, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, actually recorded. So there's plenty to be getting on with. And I know...
And then we've got... Yeah, there's a handful of interviews booked for the next month or so as well.
Yeah.
So that's ticking over quite. So
yeah,
quite
we're busy
nicely.
We're busy with the podcast, and we've got some sessions booked in August for finishing a bunch of songs that we've been writing together as well. So we're quite excited about that.
Awesome.
Yeah,
and I'm sure pretty much everybody who listens to this podcast listens to your podcast as well. But for those who don't, where can they find your podcast and your work?
Well, they can stream it at sodajerker.com/podcast, or they can find it on any podcast platform worth a damn. Spotify, Apple, where else, Si?
Yeah, it's on all of them. Acast, Stitcher, anywhere you might want to listen to podcasts, you can probably find it.
Yeah, and we're on all the socials under Sodajerker as well: Twitter, Facebook, Insta. If you want to follow us on there too, although that tends to be more terrible puns than anything else. But
courtesy of Brian.
Yeah. But we do share the episodes on there too, now and again.
All right. Well, I got one final question for you guys. What will you do when the bubble bursts? I'm just kidding. Well, it was great having you guys on.
No, thanks for having us, and thanks for your questions and stuff. It was great. I enjoyed it.
It's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, no, we'll talk about the Beatles all day long, quite happily.
Youngsters from Liverpool, England. The Beatles have held this title for 8 years. My model of business is the Beatles. You know, they were 4 very talented guys.
Thank you all for listening to another episode of the Here, There, and Everywhere podcast. Thank you to Simon and Brian for coming on the show. If you have not heard their interview with Paul McCartney, I highly recommend checking it out. The link to that interview will be in the podcast description. If you like the show, please remember to rate and subscribe if you're new. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Beatles Earth, and I will see you next week. Here, there,